The house was too quiet, too large, too full of things we did not own. We lived on separate floors, dividing the silence between us like a physical boundary, until a soft, trembling knock at midnight changed everything, leaving a small basket and a child's worn blanket between us. But long before that knock, there was only the cold architecture of our arrangement. The estate sat on a jagged cliff in the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by ancient, towering pines and an ocean that never seemed to stop churning. It was a fortress of gray stone and towering glass, designed to keep the world out. Inside, it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully curated museum where neither of us truly belonged. The air always smelled faintly of lemon polish and cold rain, a sterile combination that offered no comfort. I was not supposed to be the one walking its echoing halls. My name is Elena Vance, and that position was meant for Rosalind. My sister possessed the effortless grace and the brilliant, blinding smile that Arthur Vance, our father, believed would secure his financial salvation. He had negotiated her future to settle his mounting, disastrous debts. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. When Rosalind vanished just days before the wedding, unwilling to be tethered to a reclusive stranger, my father did not hesitate. He simply crossed out her name on the heavy, cream paper replacement contract and forced me to sign mine. I became the substitute bride handed over to a man who had paid an exorbitant price for a woman who was no longer there. Julian Sterling did not protest the change. He did not yell, nor did he demand a frantic search for the original prize. He simply signed his name beneath mine with a heavy fountain pen, his expression as unreadable as winter stone. We were bound not by vows whispered in a sunlit chapel, but by ink and necessity. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. We moved into this sprawling estate, and the rules of our cohabitation were established without a single word being spoken. He took the west wing. I was given the east. We existed in parallel, orbiting one another without ever crossing the immense gravitational divide of the house. Our only point of intersection was the evening meal. Dinner was a masterclass in silent endurance. We sat at opposite ends of a long wooden dining table, a massive expanse of polished mahogany that stretched between us like a frozen lake. There was no music, no polite inquiries about the day, no soft hum of domestic life. There was only the sharp, precise sound of silver cutlery scraping lightly against fine porcelain. I would watch him from the corner of my eye. Julian was a man carved from the very landscape he inhabited. Harsh, imposing, and entirely closed off. His dark hair was always impeccably neat, his jaw perpetually locked in a state of quiet tension. He ate his meals with the same ruthless efficiency he likely applied to his corporate empire. I noted the way he cut his food, mathematical, precise, his movements stripped of any hesitation or excess energy. He never looked up to meet my gaze. He did not acknowledge my presence, nor did he dismiss it. I was simply a fixture in the room, another expensive, quiet object he had acquired. I often wondered what the millionaire saw when he looked at me, if he ever truly looked at me. Did he see the ghost of my runaway sibling? Rosalind was a vibrant, chaotic force of nature, full of loud laughter and reckless desires. I was the opposite. I was the quiet shadow, the daughter who stayed behind to sweep up the broken glass. I did not possess her striking, immediate beauty, nor her ability to command a room. I was comfortable in the background, surrounded by old books and the scent of drying ink. Yet, here I was, wearing the heavy mantle of her mistakes. The financial ruin our father had engineered was a chain dragging me down into the cold depths of my new husband's world. I harbored no illusions about my worth in this house. I was collateral, a living, breathing payment for a debt I did not incur. The dining room itself seemed to mock my predicament. Above the table hung a massive crystal chandelier, casting fragmented, icy shards of light across the room. The shadows it threw against the velvet-lined walls looked like the bars of an elegant cage. During those endless meals, the silence had teeth. It gnawed at the edges of my composure, urging me to scream, to shatter a glass, to do anything to force a reaction from the stoic man sitting 20 feet away. But I held my tongue. I clung to my pride like a shield. I would not offer him the satisfaction of seeing me break. I would mirror his coldness with my own unwavering calm. When dinner concluded, He would place his linen napkin perfectly beside his plate, rise with a fluid, silent motion, and disappear into his study. I would retreat to my room, the two of us perfectly executing the choreography of our loveless arrangement. To survive the crushing weight of that silence, I retreated into the only world I could control. My bedroom became my sanctuary, heavily perfumed with the deep, earthy scent of black calligraphy ink and pressed paper. I was a calligrapher by trade, a quiet artisan accustomed to the slow, deliberate rhythm of forming letters. Every night after our wordless dinners, I would sit at my desk and arrange my tools. It was a ritual of survival. I aligned my bamboo brushes to the exact millimeter, ensuring the tips pointed perfectly toward the top of the desk. I smoothed the edges of my parchment, running my fingertips over the textured fibers. I ground the ink block against the stone, letting the repetitive, circular motion ground my racing thoughts. The rhythmic friction was a soothing counter-melody to the howling coastal wind outside. I poured my focus entirely into the strokes, creating beautiful, sweeping lines of text that held no meaning other than the act of their creation. It was a way to maintain my dignity. Not because I wanted to ignore him, but because I refused to let the cold magnitude of his world erase my own. I would not shrink. I would not fade into the gray stone of his fortress. Days bled into weeks, turning into a month of this suspended animation. The temperature outside plummeted as late autumn surrendered to a bitter, unforgiving winter. The storms grew more violent, thrashing against the tall windows of the estate, isolating us further from the rest of humanity. Inside, the temperature between Julian and me remained perfectly, chillingly constant. I memorized the subtle shifts in the house's atmosphere, the way the heavy oak doors groaned slightly when the air pressure dropped, the faint, metallic scent of the central heating kicking to life in the early hours of the morning, the deep, resonant ticking of the grandfather clock in the main foyer that marked the agonizingly slow passage of our shared isolation. I was highly observant, cataloging these details to anchor myself, a quiet underdog holding on to the last shreds of her autonomy in a world defined by a transactional covenant. I expected this to be my life indefinitely, a long, unbroken stretch of quiet dignity and polite distance. Then came the night. The storm finally broke our fragile equilibrium. It was a Tuesday in the middle of our third month together. The coastal storm had escalated from a persistent drizzle to a violent gale. Rain lashed against my bedroom window with the force of thrown gravel. The wind howled through the ancient pines outside, a mournful, hollow sound that made the massive estate feel incredibly fragile. I was awake, sitting at my desk with a dry brush in my hand, staring blindly at a blank sheet of parchment. The sheer volume of the storm made it impossible to find the quiet rhythm I needed to write. Somewhere between the crashing of the thunder and the shrieking of the wind, I heard it. It was not a loud noise. It was not a grand, dramatic entrance. It was a soft, trembling knock at the heavy front door. At first, I convinced myself it was merely a branch, striking the heavy oak, or a trick of the chaotic weather. I held my breath, listening intently. A minute passed in agonizing suspense. Then, it came again. 3 rapid, muffled thumps, too rhythmic to be nature, too low to be a delivery. It was the sound of desperation. I set my brush down. The hair on my arms stood on end as a profound sense of unease washed over me. I did not bother to search for a robe. I simply pulled my thin cardigan tighter around my shoulders and left my sanctuary. The hallway was submerged in deep shadows, illuminated only by the occasional, jagged flash of lightning that pierced the skylights. The marble floor was shockingly cold against my bare feet, the chill seeping directly into my bones. I descended the grand, sweeping staircase, my hand trailing along the freezing wrought iron banister. The house felt impossibly vast and menacing in the dark. When I reached the foyer, the knocking had stopped. The silence that replaced it was infinitely worse. I approached the massive double doors, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I undid the heavy brass deadbolts, the metallic clicks echoing loudly in the cavernous space. I grasped the iron handle and pulled the door inward. A violent gust of wind immediately tore through the opening, driving freezing rain into my face and soaking the hem of my nightgown. I blinked against the deluge, peering out into the pitch-black night. At first, I saw nothing but the rain-swept stone of the portico. I was about to close the door, cursing my overactive imagination, when a small muted whimper cut through the roar of the storm. I looked down. Sitting on the soaked mat, partially shielded by the architectural overhang, was a large wicker basket. Inside the container, huddled against the bitter cold, was a toddler. He could not have been more than 2 years old. The boy was wrapped tightly in a worn blanket, a faded blue wool fabric that was damp at the edges, smelling faintly of lavender and old rain. Beside his small, trembling form rested a basket of letters, the paper beginning to warp from the moisture in the air. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp gasp of pure shock. I dropped to my knees on the freezing stone, oblivious to the rain, soaking through my clothes. I reached out with shaking hands and pulled the heavy wicker basket across the threshold, dragging it into the dry foyer. I slammed the heavy oak door shut behind me, plunging us back into the dim, quiet interior of the estate, instantly cutting off the roar of the storm. The sudden silence was deafening. I knelt over the basket, my hands hovering over the small child. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, his lower lip quivering silently. He did not scream. He was too cold, too exhausted to make a sound. I recognized those eyes immediately. They were the exact shade of hazel as my sister's. This was Leo Vance. This was Rosalind's secret. I reached for the smaller basket of letters. The top envelope was hastily addressed to me, the handwriting jagged and panicked. I tore it open, my wet fingers smudging the ink. The words were frantic. A desperate confession poured onto the page. My sibling had run away from me because she was hiding this child, terrified that our father would use her son as a bargaining chip, or worse, that her intended husband would reject a tainted bride. She had tried to survive on her own, but her resources had evaporated. She was unmoored, hunted by Arthur's creditors, and out of options. She had brought him to the only place she believed the old man could not reach. She had left the boy with me. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. My mind raced through the devastating implications of this arrival. I was a replacement bride, living on borrowed time in a loveless contract. I was a guest in a hostile fortress. How could I possibly explain this to the man sleeping in the West Wing? Julian was a man of absolute control, a stoic tycoon who demanded perfection and order. He had paid for an unburdened wife. Instead, he had received a substitute, and now, the illegitimate child of the woman who had publicly humiliated him by fleeing. I expected fury. I expected him to summon his lawyers, to have us both thrown out into the freezing rain before morning. I gathered Leo into my arms, the worn blanket clutched tightly against my chest. The toddler buried his cold face into my neck, his tiny fingers gripping the fabric of my cardigan with heartbreaking strength. "It will be all right," I whispered into his damp hair, though I possessed absolutely no evidence to support the claim. "I won't let anyone hurt you." A sudden shift in the air pressure behind me made my spine stiffen. Turning around was unnecessary to know I was no longer alone. The faint, distinctive scent of cedarwood and cold night air drifted down the staircase. I slowly turned my head. Julian was standing on the bottom step. He wore a dark robe tied loosely over his sleepwear, his posture rigid. The dim light from the foyer chandelier cast harsh shadows across his sharp cheekbones, making him look even more imposing than usual. His dark eyes moved from my soaked, shivering form to the small, clinging child in my arms, and finally to the scattered basket of letters on the marble floor. I braced myself for the explosion. I waited for the cold, cutting words that would terminate our arrangement and send me back to the ruin of my father's debts. I tightened my hold on Leo, prepared to fight, prepared to pack my few belongings and walk out into the storm if necessary. I would not allow this child to become collateral. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Julian stepped off the last stair. He did not shout. He did not ask a single demanding question. His face remained an unreadable mask of winter stone. He walked slowly toward us, his bare feet making absolutely no sound against the marble. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs as he stopped mere inches away. He looked down at the boy. The toddler peeked out from the folds of the worn blanket, his wide hazel eyes locking onto the towering man. Julian did not flinch. Instead, he smoothly bypassed the anger, the pride, and the betrayal that any other man would have wielded like a weapon. His survival instinct, honed by a lifetime of maintaining order in chaos, simply kicked in. "He is freezing," Julian stated, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that barely disturbed the quiet air. Before I could formulate a defense, my husband turned his back and strode purposefully toward the back of the house, heading for the kitchen. I stood frozen in the foyer, entirely unmoored by his lack of rage. I clutched the toddler tighter, and driven by a mixture of deep confusion and primal necessity, followed him. The kitchen was a massive, sterile expanse of brushed steel and white marble. When I entered, the tycoon was already moving with that same mathematical precision he used at the dining table, but applied to an entirely different task. He had retrieved a small saucepan and was pouring milk from a glass bottle into it. He turned on the gas burner, the blue flame hissing softly in the quiet room. I stood near the island, shivering violently, holding the quiet child. I did not know what to say. The script I had anticipated, the screaming match, the tears, the immediate eviction, had been entirely discarded. The man did not look at me. He kept his focus entirely on the stove. When the liquid began to steam slightly, he turned off the flame. He opened a cabinet, bypassed the fine crystal and delicate porcelain, and pulled down a simple, sturdy mug. He poured the milk, but before he brought it over, he performed an action that completely shattered my understanding of the man I had married. Julian lifted the mug, tipped it slightly, and let a single drop of the warm milk fall onto the sensitive skin of his inner wrist. It was a practical, deeply domestic reflex. A tiny, unguarded act of care that completely contradicted the sterile, ruthless persona he projected to the world. He waited for a second, assessing the temperature, his jaw still locked in its perpetual state of tension, satisfied that it would not burn the child. He walked around the island and stopped in front of me. He did not hand the mug to me. Instead, he reached out with his free hand, his large, warm fingers gently brushed against the edge of the damp, worn blanket, pulling it down slightly so the boy's face was clear. Leo looked up, trembling, his tiny hand still gripping my cardigan. "Here," Julian murmured, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. He held the mug up to the toddler's lips, his massive hand dwarfing the small ceramic cup. The child hesitated, then leaned forward, taking a clumsy, greedy sip of the warm milk. A small, shuddering sigh escaped the boy's lips, his tense little body finally beginning to uncoil in the sudden warmth. I watched Julian's face. There was no disgust, no calculation. There was only a quiet, steady focus on keeping the child safe in that exact moment. The cold marble, the heavy corporate deals, the bitter family betrayals, all of it faded into the background, eclipsed by the simple, profound act of feeding a hungry child in the middle of the night. I realized then that my assumptions had been flawed. I had believed I was locked in a fortress with a monster made of ice. But as the scent of warm milk and wet wool filled the sterile kitchen, I saw the first hairline fracture in his armor. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. And in the silence of that kitchen, amidst the storm raging outside, the transactional nature of our marriage silently burned away, replaced by something entirely unexpected. The storm blew itself out just before dawn, leaving behind a bruised, gray sky and a silence that felt entirely different from the heavy, suffocating pressure that usually defined the estate. I sat in the pale blue light, filtering through the heavy velvet drapes, watching the slow rhythmic rise and fall of my nephew's small chest. Leo was asleep in the center of my massive, pristine bed, his small hands curled into the oversized white duvet. The worn blanket he had arrived with was tucked securely under his chin, its faint scent of lavender and old rain clinging stubbornly to the damp fabric. I had not slept. My mind was a chaotic ledger, constantly calculating the severe risks of the coming daylight. The midnight grace in the kitchen had been a shock, an aberration in the sterile rhythm of my marriage. But daylight has a cruel habit of restoring order. I feared that when the sun fully rose, the stoic tycoon would return. I expected his brief lapse into domestic warmth to be swiftly replaced by cold logic, corporate efficiency, and legal threats. He had paid for a quiet, unburdened bride to settle a debt. He had not signed a contract to inherit the messy, unpredictable aftermath of my sister's desperate flight. When Leo finally stirred, letting out a soft, confused whimper as he reached for a mother who was no longer there, the reality of our situation settled heavily on my shoulders. I gathered the toddler into my arms, carrying him down the sweeping staircase. The marble steps felt just as cold beneath my bare feet as they had the night before. But the vastness of the house no longer felt merely empty. It felt terrifyingly full of stakes. I navigated the quiet halls toward the kitchen, my senses on high alert for any sign of my husband. The room was empty, the brushed steel surfaces gleaming under the recessed lighting like an operating theater. I set Leo down on a tall wooden stool at the marble island, keeping one hand securely on his waist so he would not fall. I needed to feed him. I searched the expansive, meticulously organized pantry, bypassing rows of imported truffles and artisanal preserves until I found a simple canister of dry oats in the very back. It was a humble ingredient, completely at odds with the sterile wealth surrounding us, but it was exactly what the boy needed. I poured the dry oats into a ceramic bowl, adding a splash of milk and a pinch of cinnamon, setting it on the stove to simmer. The earthy, warm scent began to fill the cold air, a small, stubborn anchor of domesticity in a room designed for display rather than actual living. From the deep pockets of my cardigan, I pulled out a bright yellow spill-proof baby cup that I had found tucked at the bottom of Rosalind's wicker basket. I set it carefully on the immaculate marble counter. The visual clash was jarring. The cheap, brightly colored plastic, adorned with a faded cartoon bear, sitting against the flawless, veined stone felt like a loud, neon declaration of our intrusion. It was a physical manifestation of everything messy, loud, and unpredictable that Julian Sterling's life was explicitly designed to exclude. I stirred the softening oats with a wooden spoon, my ears straining for the inevitable sound of my husband's approach. I grew up listening to the heavy, demanding footsteps of Arthur Vance. My father walked with the aggressive stride of a man who expected the world to immediately yield to his presence. I fully expected to hear the sharp, authoritative click of Julian's hard leather dress shoes striking the floorboards, the sound that usually signaled the beginning of our silent, intensely rigid days. I braced myself. I tightened my grip on the spoon, mentally preparing the careful, defensive words I would use to plead for the child's right to stay just a little longer. But the sharp clicking never came. Instead, I heard a faint, muffled shifting in the corridor. I paused, turning my head toward the archway, through the gap in the heavy oak doors. I caught sight of the millionaire moving down the long hallway. Julian was not wearing his tailored suit jacket, nor was he wearing his formal leather shoes. He was in his socks, his broad shoulders slightly hunched as he navigated the space outside the guest wing. I watched, utterly transfixed as he deliberately and painstakingly altered his gait. He was walking with shorter, lighter steps, shifting his considerable weight carefully to the outside of his feet to avoid the heavy heel strike that usually echoed through the cavernous house. He paused near the door of the room, where he likely assumed the toddler was still sleeping. He waited a fraction of a second, testing his weight to ensure no hidden floorboard creaked beneath him, before continuing toward the kitchen in absolute silence. The breath caught in my throat. This was not a man preparing to summon his lawyers to evict a nuisance. This was a man subconsciously minimizing his own physical footprint to protect the fragile sleep of a child he had met only hours ago. It was a tiny, almost invisible concession, but in the context of his rigid, heavily controlled existence, it felt like the shifting of tectonic plates. When Julian finally stepped into the kitchen, his dark eyes immediately found Leo sitting at the island. The boy was staring at the tall man with wide, curious hazel eyes, swinging his small legs against the base of the stool. Julian did not say a word. He walked to the opposite side of the island, his gaze briefly dropping to the bright yellow, spill-proof baby cup, and then to the simmering pot on the stove. His jaw remained locked in its usual tense line, but the freezing hostility I had anticipated all night was completely absent. I poured the warm mixture into a smaller bowl and slid it carefully toward the child, placing the yellow cup beside it. Leo immediately reached for the plastic cup with clumsy hands, knocking it slightly so it spun dangerously on the smooth stone. Before it could slide off the edge and shatter the quiet, Julian's large hand shot out, catching the cylinder with effortless quiet reflexes. He did not hand it to me to fix. He righted the cup, adjusted its position so it was perfectly within the toddler's reach, and then stepped back, picking up his own black coffee. There was no grand conversation. There was no tense renegotiation of our living arrangement or our contract. We simply stood on opposite sides of the marble island, separated by a steaming bowl of dry oats and a 2-year-old who was entirely oblivious to the heavy, unsaid truce settling over the room. The silence between us had fundamentally changed. It no longer had teeth. It was no longer a weapon we wielded to keep each other at a safe, unreadable distance. It was quiet, attentive, and oddly fragile. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. And in that quiet kitchen, listening to the soft, messy sounds of a child eating, I realized this massive, cold estate was slowly beginning to answer. That fragile truce solidified into a profound, unspoken routine over the next few days. The boy's presence acted as a strange gravity, pulling my husband and me out of our separate, isolated orbits. We still did not speak of the future. We did not discuss Rosalind or the looming threat of our father discovering where his grandson had been hidden. We communicated entirely through the logistics of care. The true depth of his silent surrender was revealed to me before that first week was even over. In the vast, echoing space of his private library, it was well past midnight. The storm had returned, throwing heavy, relentless sheets of rain against the tall glass windows. I woke with a start, my internal clock suddenly registering that Leo had not made his usual restless sounds from the small travel cot beside my bed. I threw off the heavy duvet and bolted upright, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The cot was empty. The faded blanket was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. I rushed out into the dark hallway, my bare feet flying silently over the floorboards. I checked the bathroom, the guest suite, the top of the stairs, my mind conjuring a dozen terrifying scenarios involving Arthur Vance finding a way past the gates. Then I heard it. It was a low, rhythmic creaking sound, accompanied by a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the floorboards. The sound was coming from the West Wing, from Julian's strictly off-limits territory. I slowed my frantic pace, approaching the heavy double doors of the library with extreme caution. The door was ajar, spilling a slice of warm amber light from a single reading lamp into the dark corridor. The room smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and that faint, familiar trace of cedarwood. I peered around the heavy oak frame. Julian was sitting in a large wooden rocking chair near the fireplace, the dying embers casting a soft orange glow across the massive room. He was still wearing his dark trousers and a crisp white shirt, though the collar was unbuttoned and his tie was draped carelessly over a nearby mahogany table. Cradled against his massive chest was my nephew. Leo was wrapped tightly in the worn blanket, his small head resting perfectly in the hollow of the millionaire's shoulder. The toddler was fast asleep, his chest rising and falling in perfect synchronization with the deep, rumbling hum coming from Julian's throat. The tycoon was slowly, methodically pushing the wooden rocking chair back and forth with one foot, his large hand gently cupping the back of the boy's head to support his fragile neck. The contrast was staggering. The man who controlled massive industries, who decimated corporate rivals without a second thought, reduced to the quiet, repetitive labor of soothing a child's night terrors. As I watched, entirely frozen in the doorway, the sleeping toddler shifted. One tiny chubby hand emerged from the folds of the blue wool and blindly grasped at the air, eventually finding Julian's index finger. Leo's small fingers curled tightly around the thick digit, anchoring himself in his sleep. Julian stopped humming. The wooden rocking chair slowed to a halt. He looked down at the small hand gripping his finger, and then, very slowly, his expression shifted. The harsh, winter stone lines of his jaw softened. The perpetual tension in his shoulders melted away, leaving behind the exhausted, unguarded posture of a man who had finally stopped fighting his own humanity. And then, it happened. A faint, tired twitch pulled at the corner of his mouth. It was a smile, small, private, and breathtakingly tender. It was the first time I had ever seen him smile. It transformed his entire face, washing away the cold, untouchable billionaire and revealing the deeply bruised, deeply protective soul hiding beneath the surface. It was a look of absolute, unconditional surrender to the weight of the small hand holding his. I must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, a slight shift of my weight against the floorboards. Julian's head snapped up, his dark eyes locking onto mine through the shadows of the doorway. The smile vanished instantly. The rigid mask of the stoic tycoon slammed back into place with the speed of a falling guillotine. He stiffened in the chair, his jaw locking tight. A flash of pure vulnerability and mild panic, crossing his features before he aggressively cleared his throat. He did not let go of the child's hand, nor did he stop supporting the boy's head, but he carefully adjusted his posture to appear more formal, more detached. It was a futile, pure gesture. The absolute truth was already out, hovering heavily in the warm space between us. "He woke up," Julian stated. His voice was a low, gravelly whisper designed strictly not to disturb the sleeping child. He offered no further explanation. He did not defend his presence in my wing, nor did he explain why he had carried the boy all the way to his private sanctuary to rock him to sleep, instead of waking me. He simply offered the fact, waiting for my judgment. I stepped fully into the light of the room, my own defensive walls crumbling to dust at my feet. I did not demand answers. I did not point out the profound tenderness I had just witnessed, refusing to weaponize his vulnerability. I simply walked across the thick Persian rug, stopping beside the wooden rocking chair. "I know," I whispered back, my voice trembling slightly as I looked down at the two of them. The replacement contract we had signed, the massive debts my father had accrued, the bitter betrayal of my sister. All of it felt entirely meaningless in the face of this quiet devotion. I reached out, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the worn blanket, my hand coming to rest just an inch away from his on the child's side. He did not pull away. We stood there in the silence, listening to the rain beat against the heavy glass, bound not by the ink of a loveless marriage, but by the shared, unspoken vow to protect the small life resting between us. That shared vow held strong as the days turned into weeks. By the third week of the child's arrival, the temporary nature of our arrangement had quietly begun to demand permanent space. The sterile, immaculate halls of the cliffside estate were slowly yielding to the messy reality of a 2-year-old boy. It started with the scent, the faint, clinical aroma of lemon polish that had always defined the house, began to give way to something warmer, something raw and earthy. I first noticed it lingering on Julian's heavy wool sweaters when he passed me in the hallway, the distinct, sharp fragrance of fresh cedarwood shade. It was an anomaly. Julian was a man of sterile boardrooms and digital ledgers. He was not a man associated with the tactile, physical messiness of raw timber. The scent grew stronger every evening after dinner, drifting up from the previously locked basement doors in the east wing. Late one Thursday night, long after the coastal fog had swallowed the cliffs outside, my curiosity finally overpowered my deeply ingrained habit of keeping my distance. I descended the narrow stone steps toward the lower level, wrapping my thick cardigan tightly around myself against the damp chill. The rhythmic, scraping sound of sandpaper against wood guided me down the corridor. I paused at the partially open door of the workshop, holding my breath. The space was brightly lit, a stark contrast to the dim, moody lighting of the rest of the house. Julian was standing at a heavy wooden workbench, his back to the door. He had discarded his tie and rolled the sleeves of his expensive dress shirt past his elbows. His muscular forearms were dusted with a fine layer of pale sawdust. In the center of the room, taking shape under his large, precise hands, was a custom cedarwood crib. It was not a temporary solution. It was a robust, heavily built piece of furniture, the thick wooden slats sanded down to a flawless, buttery smoothness. The joints were dovetailed, fitting together with a mathematical perfection that spoke of intense focus. It was an object designed to last, built to withstand time, weight, and chaos. I stood in the shadows, watching the ruthless tycoon run his bare hand over the top rail, testing the grain for any hidden splinters that might harm a child's delicate skin. He wiped the wood with a cloth soaked in linseed oil, the rich scent, mingling with the fresh cedarwood shavings on the floor. The sheer physical labor of it, the hours he was stealing from his own rest to build a safe harbor for a boy who did not belong to him, sent a hard, painful ache radiating through my chest. He could have ordered 100 cribs from the most exclusive boutiques in the world with a single phone call. He could have hired an army of craftsmen. Instead, he was down here in the quiet of the night, breathing in sawdust, building a sanctuary with his own hands. I retreated up the stairs without making a single sound. I did not want to interrupt the sacredness of his quiet devotion. I did not want him to know that I had seen his armor slipping completely away. It had been 5 months since the replacement contract bound my life to the cliffside estate, and 2 months since my sister's secret had arrived in a wicker basket in the dead of night. The harsh Pacific Northwest winter had settled deep into the bones of the house. Outside the tall library windows, the landscape was trapped in a perpetual state of frozen gray, the ocean churning violently against the jagged rocks below. The wind battered the glass with a relentless, howling force that usually made me feel profoundly isolated. Yet inside, the sterile atmosphere of the stone fortress had fundamentally changed. I would often sit by the fire, just watching the flames dance across the rough-hewn stone, marveling at how a space built for isolation had been slowly dismantled by the presence of a single child. The custom cedarwood crib now occupied a dedicated corner of the library. Catching the amber light from the massive stone hearth, the scent of linseed oil and shaved timber had permanently woven itself into the heavy velvet drapes, overriding the clinical lemon polish that once defined the rooms. The estate no longer felt like a beautifully curated museum waiting for an exhibit. It felt lived in. It felt warm. I was sitting on the thick Persian rug, stacking small wooden blocks with my nephew. The boy let out a soft, bubbling laugh as the tower collapsed, his tiny hands clapping together in delight. Beside him lay his faded blue, worn blanket, still carrying the faint, comforting scent of lavender and old rain. His laughter was a bright, untethered sound that melted the oppressive silence of the estate, turning the cold architecture into a genuine sanctuary. I reached for the bright yellow spill-proof baby cup, resting near my knee, offering it to Leo. He took it with both hands, his dark eyes, so much like Rosalind's, curving into happy crescents. In these quiet moments, it was easy to pretend the outside world did not exist. For the first time since my father sold my future, my chest did not feel tight with anxiety. I had almost allowed myself to believe the illusion of absolute safety. I had almost forgotten that the financial debt tying me to this world was not completely erased, and that Arthur Vance never allowed an asset to remain unexploited. The heavy oak doors of the library swung open without a warning knock. The sudden intrusion shattered the quiet rhythm of our afternoon, slicing through the warmth of the room like a physical blade. I looked up, my hands freezing midair over the wooden blocks. Standing in the threshold was Arthur Vance. My father did not look like a desperate man, nor did he look like a grieving parent searching for his runaway daughter. He looked exactly as he always did. Immaculately dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, projecting an aura of calculated, unyielding authority. He stepped into the room, bringing with him the sharp, metallic scent of cold outside air and his signature bitter cologne. It was a smell that immediately triggered a deep, visceral panic in my chest, a conditioned response to years of being treated as a mere entry in his financial ledgers. I remembered the cold nights in my childhood home, listening to him bargain away family heirlooms and eventually his own daughters. Without ever raising his voice, I scrambled to my feet, instinctively sweeping Leo behind my legs to shield him from the man's calculating gaze. The toddler gripped the hem of my long wool skirt, sensing the sudden, sharp drop in the room's temperature. "Alina, you have been remarkably difficult to reach," my father said smoothly, his voice a polite, chillingly professional baritone. He slowly walked further into the library, his expensive leather shoes clicking softly against the hardwood border of the rug. The sound was like a metronome, counting down to a disaster. He did not glance at the thousands of rare books lining the walls, nor did he look at the beautiful custom cedarwood crib sitting near the fire. He was completely blind to the quiet domesticity we had built. His eyes were fixed entirely on the small boy hiding behind me, assessing the toddler with terrifying, clinical precision. "It seems Rosalind's mistake has produced a rather valuable asset," Arthur noted, a patronizing curve touching his lips. The words struck me like a physical blow. "He is a child," I whispered fiercely, my hands trembling as I kept them firmly at my sides, refusing to let him see my terror. "He is your grandson. He is Leverage," my father corrected, his smile never ring. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a thick, sealed envelope. He tossed it casually onto the mahogany desk in the center of the room. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. I had no reason to explain the contents of that envelope. My father never had to scream or throw a physical tantrum to express his demands. The heavy parchment spoke entirely for him. I had seen the recent financial headlines left on Julian's study table. Arthur's overseas ventures had suffered a catastrophic collapse. His creditors were circling, and his estate was on the verge of total liquidation. He desperately needed a massive injection of capital, and Julian Sterling's deep pockets were his only remaining target. This demand letter was a bloodless, bureaucratic extortion. I knew exactly what it threatened: pay the debts or face a highly publicized, incredibly messy custody lawsuit over Rosalind's illegitimate son. Arthur knew Julian valued privacy and absolute control above all else. He was deliberately threatening to drag the pristine Sterling name through the mud, turning our quiet sanctuary into cheap tabloid fodder. He was looking at a 2-year-old child and seeing nothing but a bargaining chip to balance his failing ledgers. "You have no right to him," I said, my voice barely a breath. "You drove Rosalind away. You don't care about this boy." "Rights are dictated by those who can afford the best lawyers," he corrected gently. Pulling a heavy gold pocket watch from his waistcoat, the metallic click of the casing echoed in the vast room. "The legal filings will begin tomorrow morning, Elena. Everything has a price." "Not everything." The voice did not come from me. It came from the shadowed archway of the library doors. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet another 10 degrees. Julian Sterling stood in the threshold. He had discarded his suit jacket, wearing only a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, exposing the faint dusting of cedarwood shavings on his forearms. His dark hair was slightly messy, but his posture was a terrifying study in absolute, lethal stillness. He did not look angry. He looked like a glacier, immense, unyielding, and capable of crushing anything in its path. My father turned, his polite smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Julian, I came to discuss a pressing familial matter." Julian did not acknowledge the greeting. He stepped fully into the room, his eyes moving past Arthur entirely to focus on me. He took in the sight of my trembling hands, the defensive way I was shielding Leo, and the pale terror on my face. His jaw locked into a rigid, unforgiving line. Without a single word, the stoic tycoon walked toward the mahogany desk. He moved with deliberate, mathematical precision, but the energy radiating from him was infinitely dangerous. He had no reason to shout. The heavy silence he brought with him possessed its own suffocating gravity. "A custody lawsuit," Julian murmured, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that barely disturbed the quiet air as he stared down at the envelope. Arthur took a slight step back, subconsciously recognizing the physical threat standing before him. "It does not have to be unpleasant. We are all businessmen here. We understand the cost of doing business." Julian did not open the envelope. With a slow, deliberate motion, he tore the heavy paper perfectly in half. "Garbage," he said, dropping the torn pieces into the small brass wastebasket beside the desk. He leaned forward slightly, resting his massive hands flat against the mahogany, the immense physical threat of his presence breaking through his stoic restraint. "If you ever step foot in my home again, I will dismantle your companies piece by piece," Julian whispered, his voice vibrating with lethal intent. "I will buy your debt. I will liquidate your assets. I will leave you with nothing but the clothes on your back. Get out of my house." My father did not argue with the tone. He looked at the torn pieces of his extortion attempt, his jaw tightening as the calculated authority he had projected moments ago cracked. "You cannot buy blood ties, Julian. This is not over." He turned around and walked out of the library, his footsteps echoing hollowly down the marble corridor. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, plunging the library back into profound silence. I collapsed onto the rug, pulling Leo tightly into my chest, the toddler oblivious to the ruin that had just walked out the door. Julian stood by the desk, a silent, impenetrable wall of stone, already calculating the war ahead. A month passed. The winter grew harsher, the Pacific storms battering the stone estate as the hanging thread of Arthur's lawsuits cast a long, suffocating shadow over us. Every ring of the telephone, Every heavy knock at the front door sent a spike of pure adrenaline through my veins, freezing the breath in my lungs. I spent my days hovering close to the custom cedarwood crib, holding on to Leo, as if he might vanish into the gray mist outside. I read and reread the tear-stained pages in the basket of letters Rosalind had left, searching for some legal loophole, some hidden defense my sister might have provided, but found only the desperate outpourings of a frightened mother. Yet, as the threat outside escalated, the silence inside the estate changed. It was no longer a cold, isolating barrier. It became a shared trench. Julian spent his nights in his study, the faint glow of his desk lamp burning until dawn as he marshaled his lawyers. I would often wake in the middle of the night to find him standing in the doorway of the library, silently watching Leo sleep, his jaw tight with unspoken resolve. He did not offer empty promises or loud declarations of victory. Instead, he communicated his devotion through relentless, silent actions. He made sure a fresh cup of chamomile tea was waiting on the worn counters for me every morning, the warmth seeping into my cold hands. When my anxiety peaked and I forgot to eat, I would find a tray of warm broth and bread left quietly outside my door. He repaired the latch on the heavy library doors so the winter drafts would not reach the crib. He became a quiet, unyielding shield, absorbing the blows of Arthur's legal machinery so I would not have to. There were evenings when the pressure seemed unbearable. I would sit by the fire, holding Leo's worn blanket to my chest, staring blindly into the flames. On those nights, Julian would enter the room, sit in the armchair opposite mine, and simply exist beside me. No music, no vows, just silence. It was a silence that held me together when I felt entirely unmoored. It was exactly 6 months since the replacement contract had brought me to this cliffside fortress when the heavy atmosphere finally broke. The evening storm was particularly violent, rain slashing against the glass in a chaotic rhythm that drowned out the rest of the world. I was sitting on the Persian rug, tracing the faded embroidery of Leo's blue-worn blanket, when Julian entered the library. He moved with a slow, heavy exhaustion, the sharp lines of his face softened by a profound fatigue that seemed to pull at his very bones. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up, and his dark hair was slightly damp from the rain. He did not say a word as he approached the mahogany desk. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a thin, elegant silver signet ring bearing the crest of the Sterling family. He set it gently on the polished wood. The sharp click of the metal echoed with absolute finality. Then, he picked up a slim leather folder that he had carried in with him, flipped it open, and turned it toward me. I stood up, my bare feet making no sound against the thick wool. I crossed the space between us, my eyes dropping to the documents in the open folder. The heavy legal paper was covered in dense, bureaucratic text, but the bold heading at the top was unmistakable. Decree of Legal Adoption. It was printed on thick parchment, bound by a heavy red wax seal that bore the crest of the state. Beside it was a second document, finalizing a complete and irrevocable change of guardianship. Julian's heavy fountain pen signature slashed across the bottom line, a dark, aggressive vow in black ink. The battle with Arthur was over. He had won. I stared at the legal papers as if they were written in a language I could not comprehend. He had legally, permanently bound himself to the toddler sleeping peacefully across the room. He had yielded his immense power, his privacy, and his impenetrable armor to become a real unyielding father. You adopted him, I whispered softly, my voice trembling. Julian, the cost of this, the exposure. Julian exhaled a shaky breath, turning to face me. The cold, winterstone mask was completely gone, leaving his dark eyes wide and terrifyingly vulnerable. He reached out, his massive hand hovering for a fraction of a second, before his fingers wrapped gently around mine. The warmth of his skin grounded me, leaving an imprint of heat against my cold fingers. I heard you, Julian murmured, his voice thick with a quiet, raw emotion. He looked down, his thumb brushing slowly over my knuckles, as if anchoring himself to the present. That night Arthur came. I heard your terror. I felt it. He swallowed hard, his dark eyes shifting to the flames in the hearth. The ruthless tycoon was suddenly gone, leaving behind only the ghosts of a neglected boy. In this house, he began, his voice breaking slightly. He stopped, his massive shoulders tensing as the memory visibly dragged him backward into the dark. He stared at our joined hands, his grip tightening just enough to betray the absolute agony of his pasts. When a child cried, no one came. I spent my entire life building these walls so I would never have to feel that kind of helplessness again. He did not say more. He did not need to. The agonizing stiffness in his posture communicated the decades of isolation he had endured. He was not just saving Leo from Arthur. He was answering the cries of his own youth. The silence had teeth, Elena, he whispered brokenly, repeating the metaphor that had haunted my own thoughts. I won't let it touch him. I won't let it touch you. He gently pulled me a fraction closer, his warmth radiating against the chill of the room. He reached up, his calloused fingers carefully brushing a stray curl from my forehead. I couldn't let Arthur turn him into a ledger entry. Julian breathed, his gaze dropping to my lips before rising to meet my eyes again. Sometimes love doesn't knock. It waits in the silence. He slowly released my hand and turned back to the mahogany desk. Opening the heavy center drawer, he reached inside and withdrew a thick, familiar document. It was the heavy, cream paper replacement contract, the very agreement that had bound me to him in my sister's place. The ink of our signatures looked stark and cold against the pristine page, a glaring reminder of the transactional foundation we had been built upon. Julian held the document out to me, his dark eyes asking a silent, profound question. He was offering me my freedom. He had secured the child, protected the family, and now, he was surrendering the one piece of leverage he held over my life. I did not hesitate. I reached out, my fingers grasping one side of the thick paper while his massive, calloused hands gripped the other. No words were required between us. With a simultaneous, deliberate pull, we tore the replacement contract straight down the middle. The sound of the thick paper ripping was a sharp, satisfying punctuation in the quiet room, louder than the storm outside. We let the split pieces fall onto the desk, watching them come, to rest right beside his silver signet ring and the adoption decree. Julian stepped immediately into my space, wrapping his strong arms around my waist and pulling me flush against his chest. I let my forehead rest against him, closing my eyes as I breathed in the deep scent of cedarwood and rain. His massive frame trembled slightly as he finally dropped the crushing weight of his solitary existence, burying his face in my hair. We stood there in the quiet sanctuary of the library, the sound of the storm raging outside completely irrelevant against the profound, hard-won peace we had just claimed. The replacement contract was nothing but paper. The real vow was written right here, in the quiet, steady rhythm of his heart beating against mine. When I finally stepped back from the embrace, the sudden rush of cool air in the space between us felt remarkably different than the freezing isolation that had defined my early days in the estate. My hands slowly fell from the lapels of his crisp white shirt, the fabric slightly damp from the chaotic weather he had braved. To bring the adoption papers home tonight, I looked up into Julian's face. The harsh lines of his jaw were completely relaxed, softened by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a quiet, vulnerable relief. We both turned our heads, our gazes falling simultaneously upon the heavy mahogany desk. Resting near the dim glow of the reading lamp were the decree of legal adoption, the silver signet ring, and the two torn halves of the replacement contract. The thick cream paper with its stark black ink lay fractured in the center of the polished wood, a glaring reminder of the sterile, transactional foundation we had been forced to build upon. Julian had torn it the moment he returned tonight, breaking its legal hold, but leaving it there felt insufficient. It was a ghost that needed to be entirely excised from the rooms we now inhabited. Julian did not ask for my permission, nor did he issue a command. He simply looked at me, a silent question passing between us in the warm shadows of the room. I gave a slow, deliberate nod. We did not need to speak to understand that the cleansing was not yet complete. This unspoken language between us had grown steadily, rooting itself in quiet moments where grand declarations would have felt entirely hollow. The millionaire stepped forward, his massive hands reaching out to gather the pieces of the heavy parchment. He lifted them with a quiet reverence, not for what they were, but for what their destruction represented. He turned away from the desk and walked slowly across the thick Persian rug toward the massive stone hearth at the far end of the room. I followed a step behind him, the thick wool of my long skirt whispering softly against the floorboards, tracing the path he had worn into the very fabric of this house. When we reached the fireplace, Julian stopped. He transferred the torn pages into his left hand and reached out with his right, his large fingers grasping the heavy iron fireplace poker resting against the rough-hewn stone surround. The fire had burned down to a low, smoldering bed of glowing orange coals, fighting a losing battle against the persistent coastal drafts creeping down the chimney. The cold always tried to find a way back in, but tonight we were holding it at bay. With slow, deliberate movements, he drove the heavy iron tip into the center of the ash. The sharp, metallic scrape against the stone base echoed clearly in the quiet room. He shifted the charred logs, exposing their glowing, superheated cores to the oxygen in the room. A sudden, bright flare of orange flame erupted, casting dancing shadows across high sharp angles of his face and illuminating the dusting of fine cedarwood shavings still clinging to his forearms. He worked the fire not with the aggressive, frantic energy of a man seeking to destroy his past, but with the measured, careful focus of a craftsman preparing to forge something entirely new. His physical strength, once a barrier that kept the world at a safe distance, was now completely dedicated to building a hearth for our small family. When the flames were licking steadily against the blackened brick, Julian set the iron tool aside. He looked down at the torn pieces of the replacement contract in his hand. He did not say a word. He simply extended his arm and dropped the heavy parchment directly into the center of the rekindled fire. I stood perfectly still beside him, watching the physical manifestation of my father's greed meet its absolute end. The thick, cream-colored paper did not burn immediately. It seemed to resist, the heavy fibers warping and curling inward as the intense heat attacked the edges. Slowly, the pristine white surface began to brown, crisping into a fragile, creeping blackness that eagerly swallowed the harsh, typed legal jargon. It was a deeply satisfying sight, a quiet retribution against a system that had tried to commodify my existence and treat a sleeping child as mere leverage. My chest rose and fell in a steady, unbroken rhythm, feeling lighter with every word that dissolved into smoke. But as the flames flared higher, feeding on the dry paper, I realized Julian was not watching the fire. I turned my head slightly, observing the man beside me. His dark, exhausted eyes were entirely fixed on the very bottom of the burning page. He was not looking at Arthur Vance's demands, nor was he looking at his own signature. He was watching the elegant, sweeping calligraphy of my name. The careful, steady letters I had drawn to maintain my quiet dignity in a sterile room 6 months ago. As it caught the fire, he watched the ink of my identity turn to ash, his gaze unwavering as the heat devoured the last remaining piece of my bound, captive past. He was ensuring that the woman who had been sold into this house was completely, irrevocably erased, leaving behind only the woman who had chosen to stay. The paper finally collapsed, losing its structural integrity and dissolving into weightless, glowing gray flakes that drifted up the dark chimney chute. The heavy scent of burning parchment mingled with the faint aroma of the cedarwood clinging to his shirt, creating a sensory marker that I knew would forever define this exact moment in my memory. The transaction was over. The debt was settled, not with money, but with ash and absolute truth. Julian let out a long, shuddering breath, the sound barely audible over the crackling logs. He turned his head to look down at me, the amber light of the hearth reflecting in his dark eyes. "Write the life you want," my husband whispered, his gravelly baritone stripped of all its usual corporate armor, leaving only a raw, unwavering devotion. "I'll meet you there." I did not feel a sudden, euphoric rush of adrenaline, nor did I feel the urge to offer a grand, theatrical declaration of my own. I did not want to disrupt the sacred gravity of the room. Instead, I felt a deep, profound anchoring. It was a heavy, settling peace, like the dropping of a massive ship's anchor into still, dark waters. I simply reached out and rested my palm flat against his chest, right over the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart. He covered my cold hand with his warm one, his thumb brushing slowly over my knuckles. We stood there in the shared silence, letting the fire completely consume the ashes of the old world. His pulse was steady, a silent vow vibrating beneath my fingertips, assuring me that the safety we had carved out of this storm was permanently real. Eventually, The violent lashing of the storm outside began to soften. The chaotic howling of the coastal wind gradually dropped to a low, mournful hum, and the aggressive strike of the rain against the glass transitioned into a steady, rhythmic tapping. The sudden drop in atmospheric tension seemed to signal a shift in the house itself. The vast, echoing cliffside estate, which had once felt like a beautifully curated prison, now felt like a heavy protective shell wrapped securely around the three of us. I gently withdrew my hand from his chest, offering him a small, reassuring smile before turning away from the hearth. I walked quietly across the room toward the small, dark wood serving cart, positioned near the tall bookshelves. It had become my personal station over the last few months, a small corner of domesticity I had carved out of his imposing library. The polished wood of the cart gleamed softly under the library lamps, holding the simple tools of our daily quiet rituals. There was a stack of my calligraphy paper on the lower shelf, resting right next to his leather-bound ledgers. We had slowly blended our lives together in these small, unnoticeable ways, long before the paperwork made it official. I filled the electric kettle with fresh water and clicked it on. The low, rising hum of the boiling water was a comforting, ordinary sound that stood in stark contrast to the massive legal and financial wars Julian had just finished fighting. I moved with slows, deliberate precision, finding comfort in the simple ritual. The methodical nature of brewing tea had always been my anchor when the world felt too heavy. I opened a small tin and measured out dried chamomile flowers, the sweet, apple-like scent instantly blooming in the cool air and cutting through the lingering, bitter smell of the burnt parchment. I arranged 2 heavy ceramic teacups on a small wooden tray. They were not the fine, translucent porcelain Arthur Vance would have demanded, the kind that required a delicate, anxious touch to avoid shattering. They were thick, rustic, and deeply practical, possessing a solid weight that felt grounding in the palms of my hands. I poured the steaming water over the loose flowers, watching the liquid turn a soft, pale gold. The steam rose in delicate, twisting ribbons, carrying the soothing scent of chamomile into the expansive room. It smelled like the small, crowded kitchen of my childhood, a stark and comforting contrast to the cold marble that defined the rest of the estate. While the tea steeped, my gaze drifted across the room to the quiet corner, catching the peripheral warmth of the fire. The custom cedarwood crib stood like a fortress within a fortress. I walked silently over the thick Persian rug, approaching the wooden rails. Leo was fast asleep, utterly oblivious to the fact that his entire future had just been permanently secured in the span of a single evening. The toddler was lying on his side, his chest rising and falling in a deep, undisturbed rhythm. His faded blue worn blanket was tucked securely around his waist, doing its quiet work of providing familiar comfort. I remembered the stormy night he had first arrived on our doorstep wrapped in that very same blanket, a fragile bundle left in the freezing rain, with only a basket of letters to explain his existence. The sheer terror of that night felt like a lifetime ago. Now, he was entirely safe within these walls. The yellow spill-proof baby cup rested on the small side table nearby. Another, quiet, colorful reminder of how completely this sterile house had rearranged itself to accommodate the messy, beautiful reality of raising a child. But as I looked closer, I noticed a new addition to the boy's small, heavily guarded world. Tucked securely under his small arm, pressed gently against his chest, was a small woolen toy. It was a clumsily knitted bear, soft and unassuming, its dark yarn eyes staring blankly out into the room. It was not an expensive, imported luxury item. It was a simple, tactile object of comfort, something Julian must have quietly procured and placed there without ever mentioning a word of it to me. It was yet another silent act of service, another piece of invisible armor he had provided to keep the boy's nightmares at bay. I reached through the smooth wooden slats, my fingertips lightly brushing a stray curl of dark hair away from Leo's warm forehead. The child let out a soft, contented sigh, leaning his cheek heavier into the mattress. The sheer, terrifying vulnerability of loving someone this small was overwhelming, but looking at the robust cedarwood joints Julian had cut with his own hands, the fear was entirely manageable. We had built a sanctuary. The ruthless billionaire, who once controlled industries with a cold, detached efficiency, had surrendered his entire empire to the quiet, sleeping breaths of a nursery. I turned back to the serving cart, pouring the steeped chamomile tea into the waiting ceramic teacups. I picked up the wooden tray and carried it over to the small, velvet-lined settee positioned near the crib. Julian had moved away from the hearth and was already sitting there, his long legs stretched out in front of him, his head resting back against the deep upholstery. His eyes were closed, the deep lines of exhaustion finally claiming his features, now that the adrenaline of the confrontation had faded. I set the tray quietly on the low mahogany table and picked up one of the ceramic teacups. I stepped closer, stopping right beside the armrest of the settee. Julian opened his eyes, the dark irises catching the ambient light of the reading lamp. He did not sit up immediately. He simply watched me with a quiet, unguarded reverence, accepting the steaming cup from my hands, his massive, calloused fingers wrapped around the thick ceramic, the heat seeping into his skin. The contrast between the man who had mercilessly destroyed my father's extortion attempts and the man who gently cradled a simple cup of tea was striking, proving that true strength was found in the ability to be gentle. I picked up my own cup and, instead of taking the armchair opposite him to maintain a polite, respectful distance, I sat down directly beside him on the settee. The cushions sank slightly under our combined weight. The space was meant for two, but it was intimate. I sat close enough that the side of my long wool skirt brushed against the dark fabric of his trousers. For a long moment, we simply sat in the heavy, peaceful silence, sipping the hot, floral tea. The warmth of the liquid radiated through my chest, chasing away the last lingering shadows of the cold rain and the bitter memories of my father's extortion. The quiet of the room was no longer empty. It was filled with mutual understanding and an unspoken vow of absolute loyalty. Then, Julian shifted. He set his half-empty ceramic teacup onto the low table with a soft click. He did not turn to face me, keeping his gaze fixed forward on the sleeping child in the custom cedarwood crib. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned his weight to the side, closing the final inch of physical distance between us. His broad, heavy shoulder came to rest firmly against mine. It was not a sudden, aggressive move, nor was it a demanding prelude to anything else. It was merely the physical collapsing of his lifelong alienation. The solid, immovable presence of his arm against mine felt like a structural support, a pillar I'd safely lean my entire life against, without fear of it ever cracking. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice a rough, hesitant breath that barely reached my ears. Even now, after securing my freedom, after adopting my nephew, after destroying the men who threatened us, the stoic tycoon still refused to assume he had the right to cross my boundaries. He was still offering me the absolute authority over my own space, prioritizing my autonomy over his own desperate need for connection. I did not tell him to stop. I did not move away. Instead, I carefully set my own ceramic teacup down on the table beside his. I took a slow, steady breath, the scent of chamomile and cedarwood filling my lungs, and leaned my head sideways, letting it rest gently against the solid curve of his shoulder. Julian let out a long, ragged exhale, the deep vibration of it humming against my side. He relaxed completely, his massive frame sinking slightly deeper into the velvet upholstery as he accepted the quiet surrender. He did not wrap his arms around me in a crushing grip, nor did he offer a passionate, theatrical kiss to seal the night. We did not need the loud, dramatic gestures that filled the pages of cheap romances. We simply sat together in the dim amber light, our shoulders pressed together, our breathing slowly sinking with the rhythmic, soft breaths of the sleeping toddler just a few feet away. The coastal storm continued to tap its weakened rhythm against the glass, a harmless reminder of the chaotic, transactional world we had permanently locked outside. I closed my eyes, listening to the crackle of the dying fire and the steady heartbeat of the man beside me. I realized then that the massive, sterile stone fortress I had once feared had completely vanished, replaced by the only thing that truly mattered. Home isn't a place or a name, it's a person. And as the night stretched on in profound, unbroken peace, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I had finally, truly arrived. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again.